Okay, I think we'll get started so we are as punctual as possible. And I know other people will come in and they will join us as we go along. So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining this Attuned webinar. Um, I have shared some links in the chat that relate to today's conversation. So for you to peruse while we start. This webinar is titled, How Can Employers Keep Parents Motivated and Engaged at Work? And in this webinar, we're going to explore the needs of working parents and discuss how companies can help support them. We have about an hour to do so. And I will start by introducing our guests. Jessica Wilen Ph.D. is the founder of Jessica Wilen Coaching, LLC, a boutique executive coaching and organizational consulting firm focused on supporting the unique needs of high-achieving working parents. She is the author of a popular Substack newsletter called A Cup of Ambition, written for mothers who care about building a meaningful career and being an involved parent. And I recommend you all subscribe to it. It's the link is in the chat. I'm a subscriber myself, and I always get some fresh insights from Jessica's writing. Jessica is currently an assistant professor in the Yale Child Study Center, and she previously served as the director of professional standards at Yale School of Medicine and the assistant dean of students at Washington University in St. Louis. She is also a proud working mom to two kids aged ages 7 and 4. Now I'll introduce myself. My name is Tania Rabesandratana. I'm a journalist. And in 2021, I won the Attuned Writer Fellowship, which allowed me to spend a year exploring intrinsic motivation in another Substack newsletter. I'm also a working mother. My children happen to be quite close to Jessica's in age. And I also write a newsletter about intercultural families called Home Mixed Home. Now, today's event is part of a series of webinars hosted by Attuned. If you've registered for this event, you're probably familiar with the company. Attuned is a platform powered by AI and psychology that shows company what really matters to their employees by measuring and visualizing the values and intrinsic motivations that drive each person. This allows busy managers to get to know their teams quicker, identify blind spots at a glance, and communicate more effectively. The result is increased engagement, productivity, and innovation, more psychological safety, and ultimately happier organizations. Welcome again, everyone. Welcome, Jessica.
Thank you.
So Jessica and I have prepared this webinar as a conversation rather than a formal presentation. So we will talk about some of these issues together, and we'll have about 15 minutes at the end for your questions and comments. You are very welcome to type your questions as we go along into the chat box or the Q&A box so that everybody can see them, and we'll gather them and do our best to answer them towards the end. Unless you need some clarification as we go along, and I'm also really happy, obviously, to answer that as we go along. So to get us started, I would like to start with some data to set the scene. I have selected a few figures of paid maternity leave entitlements in different countries using data from the OECD's family database in December 2022. As you know, there is huge variation between different national policies. And I think whilst this doesn't tell us the whole story, I think it's a useful proxy to understand a society's attitude to working parenthood. So just to give you a few examples, in Japan, the paid maternity leave entitlement is 14 weeks with an average payment rate of 67%, so 2/3 of full rate salary. The Netherlands, Spain, and Turkey, all three countries offer 16 weeks with 100% salary equivalent. The United Kingdom offers 39 weeks with about 29% salary equivalent. And the United States of America offers 0 weeks. I think we all know this is an exception, and most countries do offer some entitlement. So this is a very complex picture. There's all sorts of different laws and other entitlements after this immediate postpartum period. And we're also fully aware that the legal framework is a big factor that shapes the experiences of working parents and companies and the measure that they can take. But today we're not going to focus on that big systemic picture. We're going to focus on what employers can do at the level to attract, support, and retain working parents. Okay, so Jessica, I'd like to start from the first interaction between a company and an employee at the recruitment stage. First of all, why should companies seek to attract parents? One, I mean, why should they bother? Maybe, they only care about the qualifications or the experience of a person. Why should they care specifically about this group?
Well, I would say, first of all, it's hard to avoid working parents, right? About 40% of the workforce at any given time is actively parenting. And we know that about 80% of workers will become a parent at some point over the course of their working life. The parenting years, if you think roughly for professional people around, between 30 and 55, those core, prime parenting years, tend to coincide with a real professional sweet spot. Working parents are really in the prime of their career, so they're desirable employees to have in terms of experience and expertise. And beyond that, I really feel that for most people, parenting is a life experience that changes you and deepens you. And parenthood is often framed as a distraction in the workplace.
Mm-hmm.
And I fundamentally reject that characterization. I know for me, I became more patient, more flexible and nuanced in the way that I thought about things, and just had a greater perspective once I became a parent. And those characteristics made me a different, and I would argue a better employee. So I believe that parents really bring a unique perspective to the workplace that enhances it.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I'd be very happy to dig into this a little bit further later. What concerns do you see most often when people come to you in your coaching practice when it comes to choosing a company or deciding what job to go for, accepting an offer? What are the key factors that motivate or discourage working parents?
Yeah. I think it's important to kind of caveat this entire conversation, and Tanya, I know you know this already, but I think it's important to acknowledge that working parents are not a monolith, right? Every individual has their own needs. And at the same time, it's important to recognize that, most of what we know about motivating people in general can also be applied to working parents. And so, I've written about this before, but 3 big drivers of workplace satisfaction are a sense of purpose, a sense of autonomy. I think we often see that show up as flexibility, and relationships. So to dig into those a little bit deeper, I will say, I think one thing that is worth pointing out is that the stakes often feel higher for working parents. I think the opportunity cost feels higher. And so I hear from a lot of my clients, and these are people who are very dedicated to being in the workforce. They're not looking to leave, but there's this sense that now that they're parents, if they're going to be spending time away from their families, it has to be worth it. Right. And so that's worth it financially, but it's deeper than that. I think most of them really want to feel like their work matters in some way. So having a job that delivers some sort of sense of purpose is important. The next factor is autonomy. And so what we're really talking about there is the degree of control that employees have over their ability to make decisions in their jobs. And, I think everyone on this call probably knows that autonomy is really showing up right now as flexibility. Post-pandemic, people want more flexibility in their work. We've seen data to show that that's particularly important to working parents and working moms, most especially. And I was recently reading some data from a survey that found that 60% of people rated flexibility as more important than salary or benefits. So really, I mean, this is really important to workers right now.
Mm-hmm.
I think the tricky thing for organizations is that flexibility means different things to different people, right? To some, it's working from home. To some, it's flexible hours. For others, it's a shortened work week. And so one best practice I would suggest here is to have some sort of list of flexible accommodations that your organization is willing to make, and then give employees and their managers some leeway to decide which policies are most helpful to them and feasible given their specific jobs.
Mm-hmm. So it sounds like it's an let's say an enhanced versions of the things everybody needs on the job, purpose, autonomy, relationships, but kind of an even more acute sense of those needs.
I think so. Right. I think so. And, if you think about relationships, I think, what I hear from a lot of my clients when they're job searching is that they're paying a lot of attention to who their colleagues will be. Are there other working parents at their level and above them? That's important too. I mean, I think working moms in particular really want to see other working moms above them. They want to know that there's a pathway for advancement there. So that's top of mind. And then the final thing I would add here, this has really been on my mind lately. And I'm someone with a background in developmental psychology. So I always encourage people to look at things from a developmental lens. And kind of generally speaking, my clients are in that 30 to 50 range, but 35 to 45 seems to be a real turning point for people. I think as folks are entering midlife and starting to grapple with some larger questions of purpose and meaning in general, we're seeing this play out at work too, right? So if you think about Erik Erikson and his 8-stage model of development, the main task of middle adulthood is generativity versus stagnation, right? And so I think what I'm hearing from people in this age group, whether they're parents or not, frankly, is, they're starting to recognize that they don't have their entire lives ahead of them, right? And they've made decisions that now they kind of have to live within the context of. And so I think what's really salient for this age group, again, regardless of whether they're parents or not, is this craving for continued development. And so when I talk to clients, what they're looking for are organizations that will meet this need where they can continue to grow and feel challenged. And so, I would point that out as well.
I can definitely relate. I think being in that age range, I can attest to that. So in practice, you've mentioned a list of accommodations that companies could have at hand to give employees some choice. Is there anything else that you recommend that companies do or avoid doing at that stage of attracting people, for example, at the interview stage, the negotiation stage, onboarding, so those initial steps?
Yeah, I think some kind of concrete recommendations are to make your policies and benefits public. So this can either be putting them, on your website or including them in, kind of a packet of information you give to people interviewing. So many people who are considering starting a family, and even those who are already parents, are afraid to ask about this at the interview stage because they're fearing what that will signal to their potential employer. So I would say, make it really easy for them to find this information without asking. I'll also say that increasingly I'm hearing from people who are not parents who don't want to be parents, that they're paying attention to their organization's parental leave policies as a proxy for how they treat and care about their employees as people. So even though they may never use these parental leave policies or use the child care benefits, it signals to them that people are recognized as human beings at this organization, right? And not just workers. So, I think really paying attention to that and advertising that in an accessible way so people don't have to dig for that information. Tied to what I was talking about earlier, I think during the interview stage, really talking up what career development opportunities you have. I was looking at some data from a different survey of, what are the most in-demand learning and development opportunities, and they were external coaching, developmental assignments, and assessment tools to, kind of diagnose leadership strengths. So, I would encourage you, to turn to your employees and ask what, we know kind of globally, those are some of the priorities, but what's top of mind for the individuals in your organizations? And then, craft learning and development opportunities that meet those needs and really talk those up during an interview stage.
So openness,
I think
transparency.
Yeah. And on that, in that vein of transparency, I think the one final recommendation I would suggest, and, depending on where people live, this may already be legally required, but consider disclosing salary ranges because we know that helps with gender pay equity.
Yes, absolutely. Okay. Now let's move on on the employee journey. Let's say an employee has been on a job for a while and is now welcoming a child to their family. Whether it's their first child, their fifth child, what can companies do to help that transition? There are, before the child's born or adopted, during paternity, maternity leave, if there is one, and afterwards.
Yeah. Great question. And I have a lot to say on this topic. In addition to kind of the traditional executive coaching that I do, I also offer parental leave coaching, where I work with an employee and her or his manager, through that whole transition process, like you said, preparing them for leave, touching base while they're out, and then really kind of the most robust phase of coaching is helping them adjust as they transition back into the workplace, knowing that the identity shift from non-parent to parent is huge. But then when you add working parent on top of that, it's really a big shift. So yeah, I would say kind of, first of all, I would offer two guiding principles. The first is to consider parental leave as an opportunity, not a crisis. So if your organization or your managers are considering parental leave to be a huge hassle or inconvenience, I would strongly encourage you to reframe that. Parental leave can be a tremendous professional development opportunity, not just for the new parent, but also for the team that's left filling in during the leave. And I'll talk more about that. The second kind of guiding principle I would offer, and this comes from my friend Amy Beacom, who is the CEO of the Center for Parental Leave Leadership, and that is ask, don't assume. So again, pregnant people are not a monolith. So check in regularly with the parent to see what they need, and know that might change along the way. But the only way you're going to know that is if you ask. If you start making assumptions, I think people get into kind of dangerous territory there.
So you mean literally contact the employee during leave? During maternity, paternity leave?
Well, we can talk about that. I mean, I think it's helpful to have a keep in touch strategy designated ahead of time, so that the employee has clearly outlined under which conditions she or he would like to be contacted. I think it's important to touch base shortly before they come back, but I'm really talking about communication throughout the entire process. I was talking with a client the other day who was actually leaving her organization in large part because her manager made some assumptions around her ability to travel postpartum. So, he thought he was doing her a favor. This all kind of came out after she left. He thought he was doing her a favor by not inviting her on these different business trips, but to her, it signaled, there's no advancement opportunity for me here. Whereas if he had checked in with her and asked her, are you looking to travel? What parameters, would you like around your travel? They easily could have solved this problem and she would have ended up staying. So, ask, don't assume is really kind of a takeaway for me there.
And I assume as well that these things change over time, because sometimes we make assumptions before having a baby about what we'd like to happen. And then these things change once the baby arrives and we meet the new person.
Absolutely. Right. And that's where I think that this bi-directional communication is really so critical. So beyond that, kind of, if those are the guiding principles, breaking that down into, something a little bit more tangible, I would say, again, have information readily available. So I know there are different cultural norms around this, but in the US, women frequently don't announce their pregnancies until the beginning of the second trimester. And so, their workplace doesn't know, for several weeks, but they're thinking about it and they're wondering, what the policies are. So make sure that you have those policies and benefit information somewhere that's accessible up front. In terms of manager training, I think this is important because I've heard some horror stories about how managers have reacted to a pregnancy announcement. And so, one best practice that I would suggest is some sort of annual training for managers in how to address the pregnancy announcement. So unless a manager has a really large team, they're probably not used to dealing with parental leave on a regular basis, right? It tends to kind of pop up every few years. And that's why I think having an annual training that really the focus is on getting them through that initial conversation, having them, handle the announcement in a way that demonstrates grace and support for the individual and, mitigating any potential liability for the organization if they, were to say something inappropriate. And making that mandatory every year. And then, having, if that's kind of like the 101, like managing pregnancy 101, having some sort of online module available that talks them through a little bit more in depth, some of the policy requirements of the organization, continued support. But, again, just kind of knowing that for an HR department, this type of work might be their bread and butter, but for individual managers, they're probably not, coaching parents through parental leave on a regular basis. So making that information available. And then, somewhere, typically towards the end of the second trimester, beginning of the third trimester, I encourage a really thorough planning process. And, with the clients I work with, I have a very extensive spreadsheet that helps clients think through each of their projects or their tasks, walks through transferring those responsibilities both on the way out and when they come back in. And the beauty of this clear document is that it becomes kind of a roadmap for everyone on the team, because everybody's going to be filling in the interim. And so I think don't underestimate the power of a really good plan. And then, and I mentioned this before, but the other thing I would just kind of circle back to when we're talking about the before leave piece is clarifying with the individual their parameters around keeping in touch. So, what sort of things do they want to be contacted about? Obviously the assumption is that they're going to be on leave. They're not going to be, involved in the day-to-day. But, depending on the job, depending on, the organizational circumstances, if there's some sort of major restructuring, obviously that's something that needs to be communicated to people on leave, and thinking through a plan for that. So those are some of the before leave strategies. During leave, I would encourage managers to start to think through some of the logistical pieces. So making sure that there is a comfortable and private space available if a mom wants to pump or express milk shortly before she returns. I think it's a good practice to check in and just see if she or he needs anything. I think not only does this help you as the manager prepare for their needs, but you're also signaling, that you're excited that they're coming back and that you see them as a valuable member of the team and that you're an ally in this transition. But in many ways, I think kind of the primary task during leave of a manager is to support the remaining team, because you really want to avoid some sort of situation where people are feeling resentful about having to do increased work. And so again, here, I think communication is key, checking in with that team, doing what you can ahead of time to match tasks so that you're providing people on the team with developmental opportunities, right? So, seeing this again as a professional development opportunity for everyone. One thing I've seen companies do, particularly in states that have state-funded parental leave, is that they've been able to use some of that money that was previously earmarked for salary coverage to bring in some temp coverage. And so I think that's a best practice. Obviously, that's not financially feasible in every case. And so there, I would say, don't underestimate the power of praise, which is a 100% free intervention, but really, going out of your way to recognize the additional work that people are doing. I think this is particularly important in the context of all of these layoffs that are happening, right? Because if you're already operating on a lean team, and then somebody goes out on leave, you risk having people feel kind of burnt out. So doing what you can to thank them, acknowledge them both individually, but also thinking through, are there opportunities to recognize them to higher ups or in a more public way, so that, again, people are feeling like, it's worth it. This extra effort is worth it for them. And that's going to create a better team environment for that, new parent to come back into.
Mm-hmm.
And then, sorry, I feel like I'm throwing a ton of information at you guys, but there's
I think
just so much to say here.
Very helpful.
After leave here, I think you really want to have a positive environment that people are returning to. So, consider having some sort of small token or gift, a card, a plant, some cookies, right, waiting for them on their desk. Again, making sure that logistically everything is set up. I had a client whose ID badge was turned off and never turned back on. And so that's like a really yucky way to return from parental leave, right? So, make sure that, their computer and phone are set up, make sure that if someone's been using their office space, that that's cleaned up and ready for them. And then beyond some of those logistics, really just communicate, right? Like make sure that the plans you made ahead of leave still work, to your point, Tanya. Offer flexibility within those predetermined boundaries, and reassure the employee of how valued they are. And I think one tangible way to do this, especially once they've kind of settled back in and, they're maybe a month or two into it, is start to have some conversations with them about their continued career development. I think a big fear with a lot of new moms in particular is that they'll be kind of quote unquote mommy tracked, and they won't be considered for new opportunities. The anecdote that I shared earlier about my client with the travel opportunities, I think is a great example of, the downsides of under communication. So, really making sure that you are signaling to that employee that you are still invested in them and their continued growth.
Okay. Yeah, because I wanted to ask you about what happens further down the line when the children are growing up and motivations have changed, as we said. You've already mentioned some of these key points of communication. I'm guessing these remain valid throughout the rest of the career, but how do we help support the parents so that they stay motivated in the face of that, life-changing event?
Yeah. So, I think in many ways, the kind of key here is continuing to take a really human-centered approach to management. So recognizing not just that employees have lives outside of work and that those impact how they show up at work, but really looking for the strengths in those outside experiences, recognizing that those experiences make them better and more dynamic employees, especially in the long run, right? So, I think this doesn't just apply to parenting, right? If you think about someone who's taking care of an ill family member, right? They might be a little bit more absent in a short-term period of time, but those life experiences change us, right? And they deepen us in a lot of ways. And so taking the long view on some of those things, and communication, right? I mean, I can't say it enough, but really thinking through, making sure they have a channel to talk about what they need throughout the course of their parenting lifespan.
I think this is a great segue into the subject you've just touched on at the beginning of the conversation, which is, I know you believe very strongly that parents can develop leadership skills at home and bring those into the workplace and vice versa. So can you give us some examples of what employers can do to harness that growth?
Yeah. So you're right. I believe that there are several transferable skills that make us better in both domains. And when I'm giving a workshop and I often ask the audience, like, tell me ways that you have grown since becoming a parent and how that's impacted you at work. And so I often hear responses like, I'm so much better at time management. I'm more patient, things like that. But, I would also encourage people to think about some of the maybe less commonly thought of ones. So things like the ability to self-regulate, being able to transmit values in a meaningful way to other people, influencing others, repairing ruptures in relationships, right? These are all skills that we use in both domains. And I think it's a shame when I hear parents talk about their work life and their parenting life as being completely separate. They kind of think about the quote unquote hard skills of their job, and, they have trouble kind of reconciling that. I think this is particularly true in those early years to what they're doing at home. I think what you'll notice is that many of the skills that I'm talking about are kind of, softer skills or relationship-based skills. And, I think by the time that many professionals become parents, they have a pretty good handle on the technical aspects of their career at that point. At this point, many of them are in the managerial level or above, but there's a lot of variability in the kind of training that they've received in the leadership or managerial realm. And so I think giving them opportunities to flesh those out a little bit, giving them opportunities to reframe what they're doing. I think about clients I've spoken to who are in leadership roles and feel very uncomfortable in them. Again, I think this is kind of sometimes particularly true for newer women managers who feel like, I don't know what I'm doing. I don't know how to do this. And then when we talk through some of those concrete skills, they realize that they're practicing these skills frequently, right? Like the ability to have a hard conversation with someone. That's like a key part of parenting, right? And so kind of helping them reframe some of the experience that they've had at home as being valuable in the workplace, I think can be really empowering and help boost their confidence.
I love how this works both ways. In some people who might think of themselves as great, kind of powerful leaders at work and think like, I don't know what I'm doing with this toddler. I think it's very reassuring the way you phrase it. Okay, I want to talk about, we've talked about working mothers, working parents. We haven't talked much about fathers. And I would love to know what you see in your coaching practices are the main difference between the needs of fathers and mothers throughout these different stages that we've talked about.
Yeah. This is such an interesting question because there's such a big selection bias, I think, in the people who approach me for coaching. And I would say 9 times out of 10, it's women. So I think that really says something about who is identifying with the term working parent and who's feeling tension around those roles. The societal pressure we put on moms is just crazy, right? And, almost no one uses the term working dad because it seems duplicative, right? Like, of course, most dads work. And so, I don't hear from dads the same fears that they are somehow shortchanging their kids by having a career. I think that's really kind of, at least in my experience, fairly, exclusive to my female clients. I will say, interestingly, many of the men who have sought me out are entrepreneurs. So, we're really focused on kind of building skills that help them with business development, but they have an eye towards work-life balance and, want some help thinking through how they can draw some boundaries around their entrepreneurial efforts so that it doesn't completely overtake their home lives. So it's interesting that at least from what I see, it's really kind of in that context that I work most with dads.
Okay. I want to encourage everyone to pop some questions into the Q&A or the chat box so we can discuss them as we're nearing the end of our one-to-one conversation with Jessica. I would like you to give us 1 or 2 examples from your coaching practice of difficult situations that you think are quite typical in the experience of your clients, and maybe you can help us walk through the methods you use to work through them.
Yeah. So every client has unique goals and, I work with people on a lot of different things. I will say, one big theme that is clear to me is that, and I don't know if this is kind of coming out of the pandemic, if it's entering midlife, I'm sure it's some sort of kind of combination of both of those. But so many of the women I work with really feel like life is just happening to them, that they are passive participants in their life. And so they often come to me looking to assess their life choices and create a more intentional career vision for the next phase of their career. I would say another theme really centers around cultivating and articulating a cohesive leadership style and presence. And then beyond that, I have a lot of conversations with people about things like having difficult conversations at work, setting better boundaries, using time effectively, things like that. So thematically, I would say those are some of the overarching themes. And then generally speaking, there's kind of an arch to my coaching engagement. So we start by cultivating insight, and I do that primarily through two different tools. The first is a values inventory. So this kind of serves as a North Star throughout the coaching process, because we know when we make decisions that don't align with our values, that they won't be sustainable and will burn out. So I help people get really clear about those. And then the second is a standardized leadership assessment. And these are really helpful because they begin to help people think intentionally about their behavior and how they're showing up in the workplace, instead of just kind of taking their approach for granted. And I also think it's an entryway into discussing how other people view them and their decision making in a way that's kind of neutral and non-judgmental. So that's where we start. And then we work to clarify some goals. So a coaching engagement without goals can easily meander. So, delineating goals up front helps keep both the coach and the client accountable. But I coach through the process of goal definition. So sometimes people come in with very transactional goals. So something like, I want to be more efficient. But once we kind of start to root around in that, I often find that it's more nuanced than that. So maybe it's a matter of setting better boundaries. Maybe it's a matter of motivation. And so together we work to really get at the root of the issue, because, I'm a big believer that, we don't need like Band-Aid quick fix solutions. We really need to get to the heart of the matter. And setting good goals helps us get there. And then from there, we kind of really get into the meat of coaching, so to speak. And a client comes every week with some idea of what she wants to discuss. And then my role is to, help her or him clarify what they want, explore limiting beliefs or narratives that might be getting in their way, challenge them to consider situations from different perspectives, and then to really develop those tangible skills. And then, at the end of the engagement, we spend some time synthesizing learning, measuring results, and creating a plan for sustainability so that they can, maintain the learning and the gains they've made in coaching in the long run.
So it's sort of translating some goals that seem quite broad, like, making intentional decisions, and then turning those into very tangible steps.
Yeah, right. And, again, this is different for every person, but the piece around limiting beliefs, we tend to spend a lot of time there, right? So, those beliefs might look like, I can't be both a dedicated employee and an involved parent, or, my leadership style isn't valued, or things like that. These kind of deeply held beliefs that, we've heard messages about, either early in our life or early in our career, that stick with us and that get in the way of us making progress.
Okay. We've gone through the list of questions we had prepared for you. Please feel free to add a question into the Q&A box or the chat box. I think both are working now. I have some more questions that I can ask Jessica, but I would love to give you some opportunity to ask her some questions as well, or share some experiences you might have. And while people are asking some questions, I wanted to ask you about, you've mentioned lots of different things. Some have come back again and again. You've mentioned lots of different things like people can do at different stages. So just to really focus our attention, could you give us what's your top recommendation out of all the things we've done?
Yeah. I think maybe most fundamentally, it's reframe how you think about working parents and the external lives of really all your employees, not just the parents, and appreciate the benefits that their broader perspectives bring to their work. I think maybe that's kind of the most fundamental takeaway.
And how do you do that?
Well, I think it's challenging some of your own beliefs, right? About what is a good employee. I think these kind of outdated models of an employee is going to be 100% devoted to their work at all times is not only unrealistic, but kind of undesirable too. Like I would encourage us to not want like robots as employees, right? Like we want people that are a little bit more dynamic and, have a little bit of a broader perspective.
Mm-hmm. Do you have any concrete examples of policies, companies that have made a difference in this area that maybe other organizations could look to for inspiration?
Yeah. One organization that comes to mind is called Bobbie, Bobbie, and they're actually a baby formula company. But recently they, in response to the needs of an individual employee, they adopted a NICU leave policy. So for parents whose baby has to spend time in the NICU, they add an additional week. For every week the baby's in the NICU, they add an additional week to their paid parental leave, up to 16 weeks. This is a smaller organization. It's not some big, multinational corporation. But what I love about this example is that it's, I think, really a truly it's a perfect example of being kind of human-centered, right? They saw this need, they saw this employee struggling with this, and they were able to be nimble and come up with a policy that helped support her in a difficult time. The other resource that I would direct people to is there's a newsletter that's popular in the States called the Skim, SKIMM. It's like a women's news digest. And they have a campaign called Show Us Your Leave. And they've got a database of, I think it's like 600 companies by sector. And then they list out what their parental leave policies are. So I think this can be a really good resource for somebody who's looking to benchmark what's out there. And I think they also have some resources for how can you leverage this information to make a pitch to your own organization if you're trying to advocate for paid leave there. So that's another really good resource that I would recommend.
Could you repeat the name and then I'll try and pop it in?
Sure. So the organization that puts it together is called the Skim, SKIMM, but the campaign is called Show Us Your Leave.
Okay, I will look for that. We do have a question in the chat that I will out to you. How can we initiate a conversation with our boss who may not offer any flexibility in how we work? For example, I would love to have one remote day a week, but he is not too fond of remote work.
Yeah, great question. I would start by doing some benchmarking with other organizations in your field and see if you can get some data around other companies that do this. And I would frame it as both a recruitment and a retention issue that, other companies are offering this. If they want to remain competitive, is there any way to be flexible? I think too, as you build your case, thinking through, what are the specific concerns that this manager has? Is it productivity? Is it availability? And addressing, some of those concerns directly. And then I think you can always start by proposing a trial period, so can we try this for 3 months? And, we can be in touch about how this how this works, what tweaks need to be made. I think that can be kind of a lower stakes way of starting to get somebody on board. And then hopefully, as you know, in that period, they'll see that it works quite well and, you know, be able to extend it beyond that.
I think one concern I've seen is that sometimes we approach managers and there may be a concern that, oh, if I say yes to you on this, you know, then everybody else will want the same thing. And there's a fear around that. So I don't know if you have any particular advice on that front, that how to counter that argument.
Yeah, you know, I mean, I see this as kind of being like there's a sea change happening here, right? Like that is the traditional management view of looking at things. And you know, when I consult with companies, I kind of push back on that. And it's like, okay, so what if other people wanted it, right? Like what if we trusted our employees to tell us what they needed and we listened to them? And, you know, I think that can be scary for some organizations. And, you know, there are some, you know, I think there are some valid fears around, you know, the impact on organizational culture if everyone is remote all the time. But often what some of these fears boil down to is like loss of control, and particularly like a desire for surveillance, which I think is kind of problematic, right? And you know, I always advocate that employees trust, or organizations trust their employees to, you know, get their work done in the context that works best for them. And then, you know, if people can't do that, then approach that as a performance issue. But the majority of people, you know, respond really well to that flexibility. And in fact, you know, I mean, there's data from the pandemic to show that productivity actually increased, right, when we sent people home. And so, you know, drawing on some of that data as well, I think can be helpful.
Okay. I'd like to give everyone a last chance to ask some questions. Jessica, whether it's about some personal situation you've encountered or something a bit more general. Meanwhile, I have another question for you. You've given us some ideas of resources and places we can look at. Do you have any other recommendations for studies? You've mentioned some data. I'm always hungry for data and studies, or books that you particularly like. I know you regularly mention some books in your newsletters and you share some inspiration and questions. So anyone you particularly love?
Yeah. So, you know, I will say, I don't know of any books that are geared specifically for organizational leaders helping support their working parent employees. If anybody knows of books that take that particular lens, you know, please let me know. Maybe one day I'll write that book. But there are several books aimed specifically for working parents and navigating working parenthood. And, you know, there are a lot out there. Some are better than others. I think one of my favorites is called Work, Parent, Thrive by Yael Schonbrun. And she's a therapist by training, and you know, works to help parents both acknowledge how difficult it is to be a working parent, but also reframe some of those narratives so that they're more balanced and healthier. So I really recommend that book. Tanya, you introduced me to a great book called Couples That Work by Jennifer Petriglieri, a professor at Seed. It's so good. She looks at dual career couples across the lifespan. And that is really a great resource, I think, for couples. And again, you know, her big takeaway is communication, right? So like talking to your partner about managing the dual career work. And then I also read and really loved a book called Making Motherhood Work by Caitlin Collins, who is a sociology professor at Washington University in St. Louis. And what she did was she interviewed working moms in several different countries. So in Sweden, in Italy, in Germany, and she makes a distinction between what used to be East and West Germany because there are some policies that impact working parents there, and then in the United States. And it's a really interesting book, both to learn more about how other countries do it, but then, you know, for me, the big takeaway was how much pressure and like internalization of blame working mothers in the United States place on themselves. For you know, not being able to manage it all, whereas in other countries they really look to social structures and kind of point to social structures as failing them, in the United States, women really internalize that failure themselves. So that's a really, really fascinating book that I would recommend.
Wonderful. Okay, I've added those to my list. We've circled back to the initial mention of data of maternity leave entitlement around the world. So we've went full circle. So I think this is a good place to close our conversation. Thank you, Jessica, so much for your time and insights. For those of us who join a bit later, I encourage you to subscribe to Jessica's newsletter for working parents called A Cup of Ambition. I'm going to display the links to Jessica's work on screen. Are you all seeing this? I hope you are. Let me know if you're not seeing this. Jessica, you're seeing it?
I'm seeing it, yes.
Okay, perfect. And I will also remind you that she offers coaching services for leaders, for working parents, and also for organizations. So the links to her work are visible in here. Oh, I see someone has written in the chat. I hope this is not a question that I forgot. Okay, you see it. Thank you so much. You will soon get an email from Attuned with a link to the recording so you can watch it again or share it with a colleague. You will also receive information about the next webinar and get a chance to register early. Thanks to all of you for your attention and for your questions, and have a great rest of the week. Thanks, Jessica, again.
Thank you. Thank you. And thanks to each of you for, your support of working parents and your interest in this topic.
Yes, I was quite happy to see so much interest from all of you. Bye. Okay. Stop the recording now.